What you are about to hear is not an epic adventure in the romantic sense. It is a real, raw, no-holds-barred story. A story where life literally hangs by a thread. A story where friendship is tested at the absolute limit of what it means to be human. A story that, if it hadn't been told by its own protagonists, would be impossible to believe. Take a deep breath. Focus your attention, because what's coming next doesn't allow for blinking. The Peruvian Andes are among the most remote and isolated mountain ranges on Earth. The Cordillera Huayhuash, where Siula Grande rises, is a jagged, unforgiving landscape. The peaks of this range stretch into the sky, their snow-capped summits piercing the thin air. The wind howls through the valleys, carrying with it the biting chill of the high-altitude environment. Below the snow, rugged terrain sprawls across the mountainside, craggy cliffs and deep crevasses carving out the land over millennia. This landscape, both awe-inspiring and intimidating, is where Joe Simpson and Simon Yates found themselves in 1985. They came to Siula Grande seeking challenge, to push the boundaries of their skills and experience. But the mountains offered no concessions. The beauty of the place was a stark contrast to the danger that lay ahead. For the time being, they were merely beginning their ascent, unaware of how quickly the environment would turn against them, forcing them into a battle for survival. Joe Simpson and Simon Yates were seasoned climbers, but the challenge they faced in the Cordillera Huayhuash was unlike any other. Both men had honed their skills over years of mountaineering, taking on some of the most difficult climbs in the world. They had traveled the globe, pushing themselves to the limits of endurance. But this journey to Siula Grande in 1985 was different. The west face of Siula Grande had never been climbed before, and their ambition was to conquer it. Simpson, a tall, lean man with intense determination, was known for his resilience. He was driven not just by the thrill of the climb, but by a deep-seated desire to test his physical and mental limits. Yates, quieter but equally determined, brought years of technical climbing expertise to the team. The pair was well matched, both having faced perilous situations on previous expeditions. They understood the stakes, but this was different. Siula Grande was not only remote, but it was also known for its unpredictable weather and rugged terrain. Their preparations were meticulous. Weeks of planning, careful attention to the weather forecasts, and thorough training had led them to this point. They knew the climb would be difficult, but the mountain's sheer size and the unpredictability of the conditions were a reality they could not fully anticipate. As they approached the base of Siula Grande, the weight of the task ahead began to settle in. The altitude and the vast emptiness around them made the mountain seem even more imposing. The isolation of the place became apparent, as if the mountain were a world unto itself, untouched and unyielding. Despite the looming challenges, the climb began with a sense of purpose. The weather was calm, and their movements were measured as they ascended the west face. The journey felt almost routine. Another mountain, another challenge to conquer. But as they reached higher altitudes, the climb began to test their resolve in ways they had not expected. The mountain's true nature was beginning to reveal itself, slowly but surely. After reaching the summit of Siula Grande on July 28th, Joe Simpson and Simon Yates had accomplished what many thought impossible. They had successfully climbed the previously unclimbed west face. The elation of standing atop the peak was quickly replaced by the daunting reality of the descent. The North Ridge, their chosen route for the way down, was notoriously difficult, and the weather began to turn against them. A storm gathered, casting dark clouds over the peaks and reducing visibility. The temperature plummeted, and the fierce wind whipped through the ridge, making every step dangerous. The excitement of the summit had faded, replaced by the realization that the journey down would test them in ways they had not yet encountered. The terrain was more treacherous than they had anticipated. The snow, unstable in some areas, was too soft in others, making footing uncertain. The ridge narrowed, and the slope steepened, turning the descent into a delicate balance between cautious progress and the ever-present risk of a slip. Every step felt heavy, as though the mountain itself was trying to prevent their retreat. By evening, they were forced to stop, the storm growing fiercer, and their bodies exhausted from the climb. The pair sought refuge in a small snow hole that they dug out, huddling together for warmth. Their rations were nearly gone, and the fuel for their stove had run out. They melted snow for water, but it was insufficient. The harsh conditions, the rapidly decreasing supplies, and the fear of not being able to continue the descent the next day created a weight of tension between them. Despite the storm's howl outside, there was little choice but to rest. As the hours passed, the reality of their situation began to sink in. The mountain, cold and indifferent, was now a prison of their own making. The only option was to continue down, but the danger was clear. The worst of the climb was yet to come. The morning after their cold, restless night in the snow hole, the storm had not abated. The sky remained thick with clouds, and the wind continued its relentless assault on the ridge. Simpson and Yates, though exhausted, knew they had no choice but to continue. The glacier below, their only hope for safety, was still several thousand feet down, with their resources nearly depleted, and the weather showing no signs of improvement. Every moment counted. As they made their way down the north ridge, the climb that had once felt manageable began to reveal its true peril. The snow was deep and the ice slick. Their pace slowed, and every movement became a calculation of risk. At times, they had to dig into the snow to find enough of a foothold to move forward. The air grew thinner with each step, draining their energy and sapping their resolve. It was during one such treacherous stretch that disaster struck. Simpson, leading the descent, lost his footing on the edge of an ice cliff. The ground beneath him gave way, and he fell, first sliding, then tumbling down the sharp drop. The world around him twisted into a blur of white and blue as he crashed into the rocks below. His body slammed against the jagged edges of the ice, and the searing pain in his right leg was instant. He had landed awkwardly, and when he tried to move, he felt a sickening jolt. The tibia in his right leg had snapped, crushed into his knee joint. The pain was unimaginable. Simpson could not stand, and the realization that he was now utterly immobile hit him like a wave. The severity of his injury was clear. His leg was not only broken but mangled, and the cold began to seep in, further numbing his already failing body. The storm raged on, making it impossible for Yates to properly assess the extent of the damage from above. Simpson's only hope lay in Yates, who was left with no choice but to descend and attempt to get his injured partner down the mountain. As Yates worked his way down to Simpson's position, the distance between them felt immense. The mountain, which had seemed like a challenge to conquer, now felt like an insurmountable barrier. The safety of the glacier seemed farther away with each passing hour. Yet despite the dire circumstances, Yates refused to give up. He was determined to get Simpson down, no matter the cost. With Simpson's leg broken, and no way to move under his own power, Yates was forced to take on the responsibility of lowering him down the mountain. The first step was to assess the situation, and the gravity of their predicament became clear. If they didn't move quickly, both would be trapped on the mountain, exposed to the elements and the growing storm. The two climbers devised a method to lower Simpson, using their combined ropes. With no belay points or fixed anchors, Yates had to create his own system of control. He dug a shallow cavity in the snow to provide some stability, using his position on the ridge to hold the rope while lowering Simpson down in increments. The ropes, 150 feet each, were tied together to form one continuous 300-foot rope. This method, though time-consuming, allowed them to progress slowly but steadily. Each lowering stage involved 3 steps. First, Yates would descend the first 150 feet. Then, Simpson would be lowered further, with Yates controlling the descent, making sure to avoid sudden jolts. Finally, they would encounter the knot in the rope. At this point, Yates would unclip the rope from the belay plate, give Simpson enough slack to move his weight off the rope, and reposition the knot to allow for the next stage of the descent. The process was tedious, but it was the only way forward. Time passed slowly as Yates meticulously repeated the cycle of lowering, climbing down to his injured companion, and creating a new stance for the next descent. The storm, now intensifying, made the process even more grueling. Visibility was near zero, and the wind howled around them, threatening to tear the climbers off the mountain at any moment. But the method they had devised was working. Slowly, they were making progress. Simpson's condition was deteriorating. His frost-bitten fingers struggled to hold onto the rope, and his broken leg made it almost impossible for him to move without excruciating pain. Yet, despite these obstacles, Yates continued to lower him down the mountain, using every ounce of strength and concentration to keep both of them alive. Each time Yates managed to bring Simpson down another 150 feet, they made a little more headway, but the mountain felt endless. The thought of the glacier below, a mere 3,000 feet away, seemed like a distant dream. The snow, thick with the weight of the storm, made every step feel like a battle against the elements. But they pressed on. This period of survival, methodical and disciplined, marked the heart of their struggle. There was no room for panic or emotion, only the relentless task of getting Simpson down. Each small victory, each successful descent, was a glimmer of hope that kept them going. Yet, even as they made progress, the mountain's full weight continued to bear down on them, relentless and indifferent. By the time Yates had lowered Simpson another 3,000 feet, exhaustion had settled deep into both climbers. The storm continued its fury, making the air feel even colder, as if the mountain itself was closing in around them. The end seemed near. Both climbers were tired, their supplies nearly gone, and the descent had become an endless, draining effort. Still, there was a sense of progress. They were almost to the glacier, almost to safety. But as they descended further, the terrain grew steeper and more treacherous. Yates, having repeated the painstaking cycle of lowering and climbing down countless times, knew they were on the edge of their capabilities. The slope had become more unstable, the snow deeper and more difficult to navigate. At some point, Simpson, hanging from the rope, was no longer able to move. His hands, frostbitten and useless, could not grip the rope as they had before. Yates was growing increasingly aware that the situation was slipping from his control. And then came the moment of crisis. Simpson's body had reached the edge of a cliff. As Yates lowered him further, Simpson was unable to hold on or climb back up. The weight of his own body, the pressure on the rope, and the instability of the snow created a precarious situation. Yates could feel the strain as Simpson's weight bore down on the rope, but he could not see his companion. The air was thick with the howl of the storm, and Simpson's voice, if he had called out, was lost to the wind. Yates, knowing that his position was unstable, could feel the snow beneath him beginning to give way. The shallow stance he had carved into the ice was no longer enough to hold his weight. With every second, he could feel himself being pulled further down the slope. His thoughts raced as he realized the danger both of them were now in. Simpson, unable to climb up or give any signal, was hanging helplessly in the void. Yates could not pull him back up. There was no way to communicate, no way to ascertain the exact danger that Simpson faced. The two men were trapped, one on the cliff, the other dangling beneath. Time blurred as Yates felt the tension in the rope increase with each passing moment. It was at that point, after what seemed like an eternity of trying to stabilize the situation, that Yates realized the inevitable. The snow beneath him was giving way, and he was about to be pulled down with no way to arrest his fall. He could not continue to support Simpson's weight. If he stayed on the rope, he too would be dragged into the abyss. Yates was left with no choice but to cut the rope, severing the last physical connection between the two climbers. Simpson fell, the rope snapped, and Yates was left alone on the cliff, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He knew that cutting the rope was the only way he could survive, but he also knew it was likely the last time he would see his partner alive. Yates could only wait, hoping that he had made the right choice, but understanding the gravity of what had just occurred. As the storm intensified, and the darkness of night enveloped them, Yates descended to safety, leaving behind the place where their bond had been severed. He believed Simpson had fallen to his death, and there was nothing more he could do. The mountain, once a challenge to conquer, had now taken away everything they had worked for. Simpson's survival, after the rope was cut, was a story that would defy belief. In the moment the rope snapped, he plunged down the steep face of the cliff, falling more than 200 feet before landing in a small crevasse. His body, already battered by the fall, was left bruised and broken. The impact sent waves of agony through him, but it also revived his will to survive. When he regained consciousness, he found himself deep within the crevasse, unable to move. His body, frozen from the fall and suffering from frostbite, felt foreign to him. He could barely feel his fingers, and his right leg, still shattered from the earlier fall, was almost completely useless. The air inside the crevasse was damp and cold, but it was also still. There was a sense of suffocating isolation that settled over him. Simpson, alone and injured, had no idea what had happened to Yates. He couldn't know that his climbing partner, fearing he was dead, had already descended the mountain and was unaware of Simpson's survival. The reality of his situation began to sink in. His body, numb from the cold, was bruised and broken, but it was still functional enough to allow him to think, albeit slowly. The lack of food and water weighed heavily on him. He could feel the effects of dehydration and exhaustion setting in. His mind began to wander, each thought heavy and labored as he tried to make sense of his situation. How had he survived the fall? Why was he still alive when his companion was so sure that he was dead? With no immediate way to climb out of the crevasse, Simpson's first thought was to try to escape by descending further. His survival instinct kicked in, urging him to move, to find a way out. But there was a problem. The crevasse narrowed further as he went deeper, and his injured leg made it impossible for him to move quickly. Each movement was slow and agonizing. The further he descended, the more hopeless it felt. But then, as he crawled deeper into the icy abyss, he stumbled upon a snow bridge, a fragile structure that seemed to offer a possible way forward. Simpson's survival was built on this moment of luck. He crossed the snow bridge cautiously, unsure of what would come next. On the other side, he discovered a steep snow slope leading upwards. The slope was his only way out. He had no choice but to climb it, even though the thought of using his already battered body for this last ascent seemed almost impossible. Every movement was a battle. Simpson's frostbitten fingers and shattered leg made it difficult to grip the surface or find balance. But somehow, he managed. The crevasse, once a seemingly inescapable prison, had provided him with a narrow path out. His mind was clouded by pain, but he knew this was his chance. Slowly but surely, he clawed his way upward, fighting not just the physical limitations of his body, but also the overpowering despair that threatened to engulf him. By the time Simpson reached the top of the snow slope and emerged back onto the glacier, he was on the edge of collapse. His body, already ravaged by injury and exhaustion, was now pushed to the absolute limit. Yet, despite everything, he had escaped the crevasse. He had found a way out. But his journey was far from over. The glacier stretched out before him, endless and cold. He had to move, and he had to move fast. Each step felt heavier than the last. His body, deprived of food and water, seemed to be shutting down, but the thought of Yates, somewhere far below, and the chance of survival kept him going. It was a grim, painful crawl, but Simpson pressed on, fighting the overwhelming urge to give in to fatigue. 3 days, alone and starving, he would crawl towards base camp, each moment a struggle against the odds. The glacier was still far from safe, and the cracks of crevasses lay ahead. But Simpson, despite his injuries, had found a spark of hope, the will to survive. Simpson's mind was beginning to blur with the haze of pain, exhaustion, and hunger. Each movement was slow and deliberate, the weight of his broken body pressing him into the glacier as he crawled. The world around him was a blur of white snow, ice, and an endless horizon. The landscape stretched out before him like a blank canvas, unbroken and indifferent. The thought of the vast distance to base camp seemed impossible, but it was the only goal he had left, the only option. The cold gnawed at him, his frost-bitten fingers were stiff, and his legs were in agony with every slight movement. His right leg, shattered from the earlier fall, had become a heavy burden he could barely carry. His left leg, though less damaged, was still sluggish from overuse. With no food and no water, he could feel his energy slipping away. Yet, despite it all, Simpson pressed forward. His survival instincts, honed over years of climbing, kicked in. He knew that if he stopped now, if he gave up, he would die in the unforgiving expanse of the glacier. So he continued, dragging his body across the snow, inch by painful inch. The freezing wind bit into his skin, but it was the silence that truly pressed down on him. The isolation was suffocating. Every hour felt like a lifetime, and with each step, his body felt heavier. His mind, clouded by delirium, would flicker between clarity and confusion. At times, he could feel himself slipping into a daze, the edges of his awareness blurring as his body desperately fought to survive. The glacier, with its endless expanse of snow, seemed to mock him. No sign of life, no hint of rescue. But Simpson was driven by a single thought. He had to reach base camp. He could not afford to stop. If he stopped, he knew he would die. After what seemed like an eternity of crawling and stumbling, he reached a moraine, a rocky outcrop that marked the edge of the glacier. The landscape changed here, with rocks and boulders scattered across the terrain, creating a rugged path that would be easier to navigate than the smooth, ice-covered glacier. But even this offered no respite. Simpson's progress remained agonizingly slow. The rocks underfoot were sharp and unforgiving, and with his frost-bitten hands and broken body, every step was a battle. Despite all of this, there was still a spark of hope. The thought of base camp, just a few miles away, was all that kept him going. He could picture it in his mind, a small shelter, the warmth of the campfire, the possibility of water, food, and safety. It was a distant dream, but it was the only dream that mattered now. It was what pushed him forward, each time his body begged for rest. The cold air burned his lungs, and every breath seemed to take more energy than the last. But Simpson continued, crawling over the moraine, through the rocks, inching closer to the base camp that had once seemed so far away. His body was at the brink of collapse, but his determination to survive, his will to make it back to base camp, kept him moving, one painful step at a time. It was not triumph he felt, but a quiet desperation. He could not stop now, not when he was so close. When Joe Simpson finally arrived at base camp, it was not a moment of triumph, but a quiet, understated return from the dead. The last miles had felt like an eternity, and the sight of the camp, the tents barely visible through the fog and snow, was both a relief and an overwhelming reminder of how close he had come to dying alone on the glacier. He stumbled into camp, his body a twisted mass of exhaustion, frostbite, and pain. His face was pale, his limbs stiff, and his broken leg dragged behind him with every step. The cold had stolen much of his strength, and his energy was nearly gone. When he finally collapsed, his body shut down. But before that, he managed to utter only a few weak words, barely audible through the hoarseness of dehydration and exhaustion. Richard Hawking, a non-climber who had been waiting at base camp, was the first to spot him. Hawking's disbelief was palpable. He had seen Yates arrive the day before, assuming Simpson had been lost to the crevasse. But now, with Simpson lying there, barely conscious, the reality was too much to grasp. He had been waiting for a body, not a survivor. Hawking immediately alerted Yates, who had already begun his own descent from the mountain. Yates had believed Simpson was dead, cut off from him by the rope and the unforgiving nature of the mountain. But when he arrived at base camp and saw Simpson there, breathing, alive but broken, it was impossible to comprehend. They had both thought the other was lost. The reunion was not one of celebration, but of quiet acknowledgement. Yates, who had made the brutal decision to cut the rope, could not fully grasp what Simpson had gone through, just as Simpson couldn't fully understand Yates's pain in severing their connection. The emotional weight of the events had left both climbers hollowed. What they had endured, each on their own side of the mountain, was beyond words. Though the physical reunion was a relief, there was no overwhelming joy. There was only the knowledge that they had both faced death in different ways and emerged from the mountain's clutches, albeit scarred, but alive. Simpson's survival, against all odds, would become a testament to the will to live. But at that moment, as he lay exhausted in the tent, there was only the quiet understanding that they had made it. Somehow, the mountain had not claimed them this time, but neither of them would leave unchanged. They had seen the very edge of human endurance. Joe Simpson's survival on Siula Grande remains one of the most astonishing stories in mountaineering history, a raw testament to human perseverance against unimaginable odds. For Simpson, the experience was a profound ordeal, one that would forever shape his understanding of life and death. The physical toll was immense, with his body battered by frostbite, a shattered leg, and the harsh conditions of the Peruvian Andes. Yet, beyond the physical injuries, the psychological weight of the experience remained the most haunting aspect of his survival. The events of that fateful descent marked a turning point, not just in Simpson's life, but also in the mountaineering world. The bond between him and Yates, once forged by years of shared climbing experiences, was tested in the most extreme way. Their relationship, built on trust and mutual respect, was shattered by the brutal realities of survival. Yates's decision to cut the rope was made out of necessity, but it left an indelible mark on both men. Simpson survived, but he was forever changed by the realization of what it had taken to survive and what it had cost. Their story, while marked by a physical reunion, also speaks to the deeper questions of human nature, the instinct to survive at any cost, the moral dilemmas faced in extreme situations, and the toll that such experiences take on the mind and body. For Simpson, the mountain had taken much, but it also gave him a new understanding of his own limits. In the end, Siula Grande was not just a mountain to climb, but a force that redefined what survival meant. And so, the story closes, not with triumph, but with a quiet reflection on the brutality of nature, the cost of survival, and the fragile nature of life itself. Simpson's journey back from the edge was not one of glory, but of simple, relentless survival. The mountain, indifferent as always, remains as it was, silent, powerful, and unconcerned with the lives it claims or spares. This story, much like the mountain, will remain in the minds of those who hear it, a reminder of the limits of human endurance and the quiet strength found in the darkest moments.